Okay, and when you're ready to send me the sharing permissions. So we are live in Senate Economic Development Housing and General Affairs. It's Tuesday, January 16th. We're continuing on with our discussion of the housing crisis. And we have Maura Collins in the witness chair for the Vermont Housing Finance Agency.
Hello, good morning. Sorry, I was just getting all straightened away technology-wise. I am Maura Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. I'm excited to be back in front of this committee again. Excellent. This first slide, you know all about us. I want to point out that this year we are celebrating our 50th anniversary in April. You all will be invited to we'll be celebrating all year long. You're going to be a little busy on probably April 11th when it's our actual birthday. So we will be having our big biennial housing conference this fall as usual in November. And the night before the conference, we will be hosting a big soiree to celebrate all things housing. So
and when is that?
That will be the evening of November 13th is our big birthday party, and the 14th is the housing conference.
Which we have a lot to celebrate.
It's always sandwiched between Election Day and Thanksgiving holiday. You are familiar that we have a homeownership program, we have rental housing programs, and we're known for our research and analysis work. And I'm going to fly through a few of those foundations upon which you have built other programs and leveraged what we've done with programs in the last few years. You are familiar that VHFA is self-sustaining in our operations. We sell tax-exempt bonds, we get that money, we loan that out because it's tax-exempt, we can offer lower interest rates, and we live off a very limited spread between the rates that we have to pay those bondholders and what we get in from the mortgages we make. And with that, hold on, just trying to, which way do I want to click? There we go. Our homeowner program, again, 50 years old. You can see here a few stats from our most recent fiscal year. We did just over 200 loans. Most of those are to first-time home buyers, but not exclusively. The majority of them get down payment assistance, which is a critical resource, supported through the sale of state housing tax credits that you all have allowed us to sell and use those proceeds to give up to either $10,000 or $15,000 down payment assistance loans, 0% loans, no payments, no nothing until they sell or refinance their house. You may have remembered that used to be $5,000 we would give.
I was going to say.
Well, that started in 2015, and money has changed since 2015, and we've had to increase that. So it is true that we're probably helping some fewer number of folks, but it has kept up with inflation in terms of the material impact. Our borrowers earn around $68,000 usually. They're buying a home just over $200,000. And you can see a few of our homeowners here. I'm going to talk in a minute about how this has been a platform for the first generation homebuyer program, and I'll give you some stats on that in a minute. But you also know that we do rental housing development, and we partner with other funders like the Housing Conservation Board, the Department of Housing. There's federal funders like HUD and Rural Development. There's also some energy money that goes into housing. These colorful layers of a cake
ready for that cake.
Are what it takes to build affordable rental housing. It's not just VHFA, it's not just VHCB, it is a partnership and layers, and it is common for one housing development to have 6, 8, maybe more sources of funding to build housing.
So you're counting the layers and the sprinkles.
And so what is happening is, the $115 million that VHFA has awarded just in 1 year in tax credit equity and loans that we've done, that is absolutely creating more housing units than before. And some of the increase of the investments are because the cost of housing is going up. There are additional layers on that cake, and we are having to put more money in to do the same. And that is some of what we see with, you all probably heard in the news about the treasurer giving $50 million to VHFA for the LIAC, the local investment group, also called 10% for Vermont. I don't care what you want to call it. It is a new source of funding for VHFA. And it is very akin to the bonding that we've always done. Usually we go to Wall Street investors and we say, can we have $30 million and we will loan it out at a rate and we promise we're going to pay you back. And thankfully for 50 years, we've done that well and we have a stellar credit rating. In this case, we're borrowing $50 million from the state treasury, from the state's deposits, and we're making those loans, but we have to pay that back. I mean, we really have to pay that. We always have to pay our bondholders back. And this is, you know, committed funds that is not committed to VHFA. This is for other use. We're using it temporarily. So the terms, a bond we can issue for 30 years and we'll have 30 years to pay those bondholders back. This treasurer money, they really wanted the duration quite short. And so it's skewed to be 5, maybe 10 years that we can use this. We go up to some 20-year borrowing, a bit of it, but a lot of it is pretty short term. It's going to fund construction loans, things that will revolve and the like. The uses that we propose to the treasurer are listed here, and there's breakdowns. And if I come back in other testimony, I'd be happy to go into more detail. But really, despite what I think a few maybe lawmakers, and I always appreciate a good press story, but I think what got lost was people thought this was $50 million of free money to fall. It really is just a new capital source for VHFA. We go to the bond market. We've raised our own money through a housing investment fund that I'm so proud of, that VHFA over the last 3 years has raised $17 million from philanthropy, charitable gifts. Vermont Community Foundation has invested in us. We've started putting 10% of our earnings into this fund, and together we've made $17 million that can be a layer of that cake. This 10% for Vermont is just another layer of the cake that will get paid back.
This is a great visual and a tasty visual.
If you have,
you've got your lifetime limit of, what is it, red 40.
yeah, I was gonna say, if you're okay with artificial coloring, this is great.
Just don't need it.
I showed a lot of charts in my all-member briefing December 1st that you're familiar with. This one, maybe you haven't seen. This is just Vermont, and this shows the new homes permitted, and the red line are single-family homes, and the green line are multifamily homes. And what you can see is that single-family construction has dropped from before the 2008 financial crisis and has not recovered. Whereas multifamily construction in Vermont, we are building more densely. We're building more in downtowns. There's some good things happening. And that is a bit above, not far above, but a bit above the historical average.
And what are the reasons for that?
I would say, of course, when you ask a carpenter, they're gonna, or every problem's a hammer and a nail and all that. You're asking a finance person. I'm gonna be most familiar with the financing constraints. So we know, again, this drop off started before 2008, but I do think that the restriction in the capital available and higher credit requirements is a part of this. I would say that
it doesn't seem to be a function of demand, does it?
No, there's so much demand for single family homes. I think that there's some that would say that maybe this has been a constriction of permitting allowable use and more growth in general. We know that the number of units has dropped every decade. This doesn't go back quite as far as that most dramatic impact has had. But no, there's more demand for single family homes than anything. In this chart I showed in December, but again, focusing on home ownership and how we call it a housing market and how rental and home ownership really come together is this, which is showing that over the last 2 years, in 2021, the median home was about $260,000. And at the going interest rate then, that would cost you about $1,700 a month. So your income would have to be about 68,000. So we knew there were 24,000 renters who academically, theoretically could afford that median priced home. I don't know their credit score. I don't know if they want to buy a house. But what has happened 2 years later is that both the median home price has gone up, I would say because of lack of supply, going back to supply and demand, but the home prices have gone up, the interest rates have gone up. That means that the monthly mortgage payment's gone up to about $2,600, which requires more like $104,000 of income, which means we have less than 5,000 renters who can become homeowners. And so if you address home ownership and the stock, and if you could impact the interest rates, you could get more renters out of rental units and into homeownership. And that's where I want to bring together. Sometimes we get lulled into black and white thinking of, well, homeownership is this and it's for rich people and it's whatever. And then rentals is, you know, this other market and it's only for someone else. This is a market where people move and flex, and with job changes and everything, we know that over 95% of us are renters at some point. Many of us become homeowners, rent for a while, go back to homeownership, vice versa. And so there is so much more fluidity in these markets than sometimes the data indicates. And so, yeah.
I have a question. It's just interesting. I wonder if there's any way we could track the number of people in Vermont who are leasing cars versus purchasing cars, because when you look at this monthly burden of carrying a 6.44% mortgage, that, you know, puts a substantial increase on the burden of your monthly budget. And I am also struck by how many more people are leasing than purchasing. I wonder what the interplay is there, given that would add, particularly electric vehicles, which are expensive, leasing. I'm just curious how that tracks, if at all.
The Federal Reserve of Boston, Bank of Boston, it was Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston and the Federal Reserve in Boston both have research that does look at the preponderance of interest rates on consumers, whether it be mortgages, credit card debt, car loans, all this, and sort of the accumulation and how it impacts consumer spending and affordability and all that. And so I don't have that in my head right now, but there is research that are looking at those questions of the accumulation of higher interest rates. And higher interest rates are something that the legislature does not have an easy lever to pull. This is a financial market. But you did see a way wisely that maybe you could help with the purchase prices of homes. And so starting in the FY22 state budget, we created what was called the Missing Middle Homeownership Program. Now, the powers that be that came up with the Missing Middle Homeownership Program sort of stole the term from planners. You may have heard that, you know, really missing middle is a planning term, talking about duplexes, quadplexes, maybe 6 units per home. Missing middle income has confused a lot of people, and so you're going to hear me refer to this program as a middle income homeownership development program, because that's what it is. I'm going to drop the word missing. Good. Because it confuses other housing friends of mine. So you gave initially $15 million to this program. We opened it up. It was open for, I think it was about 6 weeks, and we had overwhelming demand of 24 million in requests in those 6 weeks. And I'm going to characterize as, and those requests came from developers who may not have regularly worked with us, but kind of knew about us, knew to pay attention to things the legislature was doing. It was a lot of habitat chapters and people plugged into what's going on, as opposed to what I will characterize as, you know, mom and pop builders who may not have known that there was a new program that could help them buy down the affordability in the construction they had planned. And when this program was created, it did 2 things. It covered the value gap, the difference between what it costs to build a unit and what it appraises for. And then if the builder wanted to sell that home at a more affordable price, it could buy down that price more and make it more affordable and cover some of that affordability gap. Those two things together, the value gap and the affordability gap, cannot be more than 35% of the cost to develop the housing. So maybe all your money went to the value gap. Maybe you didn't use all your 35% on the value gap, so you could buy down the price of the home even more.
Can you pause? Because I think this is this the calculation that we heard is creating a little bit of a
So
challenge?
yes, and so as interest rates change, they're always on the move, and they go up, more of the money is going to some of that value gap because the cost of construction is increasing because construction interest rates are higher than they were in 22 when we first designed this. And so as more gets eaten up by the value gap, and I have a slide on that in a second, then there's less that we can give to the affordability gap. And so we're having a harder time buying down those home prices to be where we want them to be. Now, this is a national chart. This is not Vermont data. I can't find Vermont data, but this just goes to show you that the orangey red bars show where prices were, or the change in prices between 2017 and 2020. And you can see that prices were going up by less than 10% for each of these items that contribute to home building. But that between 2022 and 2023, the purple bar shows that prices were going up over 20% for each of these items. And so that is saying, you know, when we say material costs are going up, it is real, it is quantifiable. These are not builders running away with profits and, you know, profiting off of programs or things like that. This is real. Interest rate escalation is real. These market forces, labor constriction, we know is real. And so we have to pay people more because there's fewer people available. There's longer delays in getting the right people, getting the right parts. And it has meant that costs continue to go up. And so in the program that we ran, I should have said, you initially gave us $15 million. Within 6 weeks, we had more demand than that. The demand was about 24 million. We came back to you, and during the budget adjustment process last year, you filled in that extra 9 million, and we were able to award the 24 million. I'll show you where in a second. With the homes that we funded, some are occupied currently and are built. Some are in the finishing stages of about to be occupied. Some are still more in the development phase, but the average per square foot cost is just over $300. And the median home that we're building, that we've approved to be built through this program is about 1,300 square feet, whereas the average for Vermont for the last several years is about 2,000 square feet of homes coming on. And the last two, this value gap and affordability gap, I would not have guessed that 60% of the money would be going to the value gap piece and only 40% would go to the affordability gap. I would have swapped those if you had asked me a year ago. I would have thought that we'd be buying down the affordability farther and that less would have to go to value gap. But to your point, things are changing and more has had to go to the value gap. So this has been an important program to meet the market's needs. There have been 20 communities where we've awarded this funding. You can see how many units in each town here. You can see a smattering of photos and people who are living here. I think with the geographic diversity, there's some, you know, there's certain communities and regions of the state I wish we could have done more in. We did, when we were given the 22 million, I'm sorry, we were given the 15 million and we had 24 million in applications. And then you gave us through the BAA an extra 9 million. We could have just funded the applications we had waiting in the wings. We didn't. We opened the door again to new applications after doing pretty extensive outreach, especially in southern Vermont, where we hadn't originally gotten a lot of applications, as well as the Northeast Kingdom. We really focused on those areas to do more activity. And that upset some of our applicants. I want to be very honest. They're like, well, we we're the reason you got the extra 9 million, there was 24 million in demand, you should just have funded us. But that wouldn't have met the legislative, what we were told to do by you all, and to ensure geographic distribution and equitable availability of resources. They may have been first in line, but we really want to spend more time trying to reach smaller developers and things like that. And I'm pleased with what we were able to do.
Well, Newport in particular. I mean,
Yeah.
Northeast Kingdom benefited from that extra, but sadly more than Southern Vermont. I mean,
And so we have continued to do road shows talking about this program a bit in hopes that maybe it'll come back someday, which is what I'm about to get to. With the funding that we've been awarded, we did fund just under 140 homes. I mentioned the bedrooms because I think that's closer to a proxy of how many people are served, although not cleanly. We've given about 155,000 to each home, and the price to buyers has been under $200,000. Now, in the legislation, you all required that a third of the money go to shared equity homes. Perpetual affordability, permanent affordability is an important policy goal in the state, and so you want to make sure that a third of the money went there.
we had quite a robust discussion.
In practice, just about half the money went there. And that's because there's another provision where you all have directed us to say, when you deal out the money, make sure you have geographic distribution. Make sure you are doing energy efficiency. Make sure you are doing a lot of what I would call public policy goals. And one of them was hit the deepest affordability you can. And so there were a lot of Habitat homes and shared equity homes that were funded through this program.
This slideshow you have sent obviously to Magali, great. So it's on their website. Yeah, great.
So so I am requesting on the House side in the Budget Adjustment Act for additional funding of another slog of money for this. So last time was 24 million. I did round up and go to 25 million. To get too much smaller than that, it's not, we'll be able to only do 1 or 2 projects. We'd like to be able to continue to build out the geographic distribution here and open the program up again for this spring. We are continue to work with home builders and developers because of the 10% for Vermont funding we were given, because of a rental revolving loan fund you all approved, which I'm not prepared to talk about today, but I'm happy to come back and do. We did a road show of regional meetings as well as online meetings, and we're just talking about these new programs so that people were familiar with them and got introduced to them. And I'm not sorry to say, but interest in programs like this that were open and now closed is growing because they're saying, well, hold on, you know, I have a couple homes in a larger development that's already permitted, approved, maybe they're under construction, that they'd be willing to put through this program. But they need to see that signal of funding available in order to make sure that those homes meet the specs that we have in our requirements.
And do you have support from the administration on this?
It's not in, it's not in their budget adjustment conversations, no. So.
Do you have opposition from the administration on this?
No, and H7, there's 13.
9719.
That bill that was announced last week does have homeownership money for VHFA to do similar but slightly different program. I am speaking now representing my staff. I'm nervous about standing up a similar but slightly different program and the administrative burden that would take, whereas more money for an existing program would be easier to administer. I think we can do it faster. We don't have to have the same new legal agreements. For instance, the rental revolving loan fund, we're still waiting on a grant agreement from the state as an example. There are real delays, and the home buying window is so limited in Vermont that, so my point is that the administration does have some program language, it's not their budget, obviously, but program language to support VHFA doing more homeownership.
I always wonder, and this is a discussion that we were having, I think, before most of the committee came in, about just the cost of doing things, particularly the cost of doing things when programs are involved. Do you know if there are any numbers that just look at either cost per square foot or the cost of single-family residence put through a program like this as opposed to something done in the marketplace today, such as it is?
I think didn't you tell us it's brought down this cost per square foot considerably to $300 a square foot?
Well, so the question is, if I look at MLS data for new construction, how does that compare?
Oh, yeah, that would be.
And I haven't done that, and it's a really good point that I don't want to say willing to do, but I think that would be a good activity. We've done it on the multifamily side, and it's very hard because the numbers aren't so public.
Yeah.
But because of the MLS, we actually would have what you're talking about, and I think it's a good point to look at the per square foot. I mean, obviously the costs here are going to be lower because we're building more modest homes, and I say there's a value in that. Just bringing on 1,300 square foot homes is going to
put a
help.
ceiling even on
Yeah.
marketplace on the homes in MLS.
Yeah, but
So
still,
to
you're right.
eliminate, in other words, to try to do more of a balance between like commodities.
Yeah.
One of the things that just has always been a concern is that whenever you have public financing with all of the hands and administrative cost and everything else that's involved, as well as the specifications, that you add a layer of cost that doesn't exist in the real marketplace. And trying to get just a handle on what that is.
Yeah, and I think in my December comments to legislature, I talked about how I actually feel like calling the work we do housing is a real injustice and misnomer, because when it comes to the publicly supported housing that we're building, we're not just building housing. I will be on the record as to say we could build housing cheaper, but there would not be units set aside for the homeless. It probably wouldn't be in a downtown, which is a more constrained environment where you don't have site control around. You can't store your materials on site. You have to ship them in every day to a downtown location. It might be in a floodplain. It might be not the greenest building. The operating cost may be higher. And so there's extra things we're doing when you put public resources in that go far beyond housing and start to get to meeting climate change goals, meeting health outcomes, because it's healthier, greener housing and the like. And so it's what housing dollars are paying for more than just housing. Right now, I'm aware that they're paying for services. So to the extent that the AHS budget is not keeping up with where it needs to be, that's coming out of housing resources. And
but one of the things that I think we try to do when we figure out what we're spending for housing, what does it cost, is you almost have to separate out these extra costs and enumerate them so that you know what you're getting. But the complaint that you constantly hear is that housing costs too damn much. And then, as we were discussing, you look at particular examples of housing projects and you look at the cost per unit and you're appalled. And people are appalled, and people can't afford it. And as you see the gap that we're having, and so my question really is, well, what does the real market look like? The real market doing things like this, and if we're doing something separate, well, perhaps at least we should account for it so we know what those costs really are.
Yeah, and what the real market is doing is building big homes. And this program does address that we are impacting the market.
Well, that was again, we had the article, which I imagine many of us saw today in Digger. There was a commentary about the cost of housing. It made some points that, I think perhaps were valid, is that are we building through what we're doing with the various programs, are we building houses that meet what people need? We're not building family housing in many cases. We're building housing that are one-bedroom housing or studio or whatever, but for the kind of housing that we're looking at long-term, are we meeting that need? And do the numbers as we construct them lead us to that end product? And it's only by really comparing, to the extent I realize we don't have very much of a market at this point. And that's another issue separately, but are we doing what we're doing? Does it match what the market is doing? And that's just a question that I think we have to understand.
But I think in what you just said is interesting, although I think rental market is more one bedroom and studio, and single family and multifamily homes are probably, the 1,300 square foot home still has 2 or 3 bedrooms in it.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the multifamily and single family homes are definitely not I mean, I don't think we're building those for studio size unless you're building a tiny home, or one bedroom.
Mara always inspires lots of conversation.
Yeah.
I just want to know, we have less than 10 minutes and I just want to make sure you can get through.
And so I'll say, the growth is in smaller household sizes. And when we talk about families, we shouldn't necessarily always think that these are
Right.
5, 6 people families.
Yeah.
A family can be 2 people, and that's where we're
Yeah.
seeing growth.
Mhm.
If, so I'll just put that up. Okay,
Right, we know that 70% of Vermont households are 2 people or less.
yes. So, should there be, funding, and should this committee at some point have to weigh in on the, BAA and think about if you were gonna support this on the Senate side when it comes over?
Mhm.
We are looking to, clean up some language. I could testify on this at that point. I just wanted to flag for you that, there's a way that we would love to be able to get some of that affordability gap money that we're leaving, permanently invested in the home. In the future, we'd love for there to be an option for, sellers at that point to repay VHFA, and we could recycle that into a similar home.
But then the home, once they
Because-
did that, then the home wouldn't stay permanently affordable.
Well, so it was gonna be, the home would appreciate, and at some point, let's imagine today's dollars, it would sell for, let's say, an equivalent of $600,000, and we're still buying it down by 50 grand. That wouldn't have the same kind of impact on the next borrower as if they had paid that 50 grand back to us years ago, and we could have built another home with that money. So it is a permanent subsidy in the program, which is just how the state tax credit program works. That down payment assistance program, they do pay us back that DPA, and we use that money for the next person. So it's permanently invested. No one's walking away with that investment and getting rich off of public dollars. It's staying in the system and doing more of that good work. I'd be happy to come back and explain that when the time comes. We do know this is a longstanding issue that the homeownership rates do vary by race. And so again, the legislature allowed us, you gave us $1 million in FY22 and another $1 million in FY23. We have been awarding first generation home buyer grants to households and had strong reception. Now with that second $1 million you gave us, the second year, we've opened this up to all of our participating lenders, and it's been a great invitation for lenders to talk with us in a new and different way about this issue. And here's just a slide if you want to read it later about who's a first generation home buyer and what we've been able to do with that program. And so that's been a wonderful resource. VHFA, our own loan production, barely matches what the state's demographics are, but through this program, we're close to 20% of these borrowers are people of color. I was asked to just speak generally about, all the things that's going to be happening this year, and I can't do that justice. I can say we are following the designation updates and the study, and I think that that's been great work that's looking to rationalize and bring a little common sense to this complicated matrix of 5 designations, and maybe there's a way to make that easier. I'm following some of the work on permitting reform. I hope there'll be a conversation about the Housing Appeals Board. I heard that you may be having speakers maybe in this committee talk about what's happened. New Hampshire has a great model of having a Housing Appeals Board over there that some of us have been looking to see if we could copy here. There's been a lot of talk about bringing down the cost of housing through I'm going to call creative construction types, the often panelized housing. It's happening across the country, but we have examples in Vermont where we are supporting the manufacturing of housing. And so we are thinking maybe it's time to study this more, and we're looking to quantify what we know of that's happening in Vermont. VHFA is very involved in the renewable energy standard and a bunch of energy policies, as well as looking at the need for more support in housing. This committee has two other issues you talked to me a lot about, so I just wanted to put in, it's the inventory of rental housing. Sometimes I think this committee is considered if there should be a rental housing registry. And now I'm gonna talk about short-term rentals, and then I'll be done. And I would propose that a rental housing registry does a few things. It creates that inventory of where all the rental housing homes are. Then I've seen it create a funding mechanism to fund the enforcement of rental housing codes and standards and all that.
And that we've put in place, but without the funding.
And
So we
so,
put the people into the Division of Fire Safety, but we haven't funded how we support them.
and so, that goes beyond housing funding directly. So I'm not gonna fully talk about that, but since I'm the data nerd who shows up, I just wanna say that, we do already have a landlord certificate that is required of all rental housing. And with a few tweaks, which you see in the green boxes here, from what I've heard various legislators looking at, I think it's pretty close to what you all are looking for. Right now, it does not include short-term rentals, but it could. I mean, I don't know, that's up to you all. That's a question. I've seen lists of we need all the landlord's information. Right now, I think it just includes their address. You could add email and phone number if you want a better way of reaching them. Right now, it doesn't speak to accessibility, and I can think of some other lawmakers on the House side who are keen on this, and maybe we should ask questions about that. Now, defining accessibility is complicated. There's a lot of ways. Are we talking physical? Are we talking impairments and all? But you could ask that question. And right now, we only ask what the rent paid is if it's somehow subsidized housing. That could be broadened to be, well, could we know what the rent is for all housing? If it's subsidized, that question's asked.
Who has access to the landlord certificate? I
That
think
goes-
that's,
That goes through the tax department.
so, I mean, that's one challenge, is that getting information from tax is often a challenge.
We're running low on time.
Okay, sorry. I mean, this will be a bigger debate.
She wants to get to short-term rentals.
So, but there's an opportunity there to, again, I think the theme here is like, let's stop creating new, whether it be a homeownership program or the forms or something like that. Let's build on some of what we have. You all encouraged us to get more data on short-term rentals. There was a 72% increase in short-term rentals from, I like to count from that June 2017 mark, where you see the data just jump up strangely. To a data person, that tells me they fixed their data somehow.
Right.
I don't know what happened.
Right.
It's national data, but I mean, it's Vermont-based, but I think that's where the data got real. You can see the months where there's the most activity and weaker points. I do want to point out that short-term rentals are not evenly distributed across the state. We do have more data, thanks to encouragement from you all to get this. We know that in September, we hit our highest point of how many short-term rental homes are out there, 11,700. We can see that folks are making about $4,000 a month on short-term rentals compared to the median gross rent earned in Vermont. It's just over $1,000. So this is going to be, there's an economic motivator to do a short-term rental. There are higher occupancy rates with them, and you can see some other data here. It still holds true that the ski communities, plus Burlington, are the communities that have the biggest proportion of their housing stock as short-term rentals. And then if you were to sort the list in descending order, there is a pretty strong drop off in the impact of this after you get past the top, I'm gonna say dozen towns. I'm actually getting this number updated right now. And we don't know things like, are these all historically rentals that are short-term rentals, or some of them homeownership homes that are rentals? Are these vacation homes that we now call short-term rentals? Are these ski condos that were never available on the open market that now are being listed through these platforms? Yes to all those things. I can't get you a clean circle diagram of what was the previous use before it was a short-term rental, because uses are fluid. Everything's fluid. And so I have said in this committee before, my next door neighbors are homeowners who have lived in that home for 15 years. they also short-term rental that place for 2 or 3 months in the winter while they go to Florida. So that is a single-family home that will be on the market at some point, but also counts in our short-term rental data. And so it's complicated. We do know that the state saw an increase of 9% in short-term rentals just between January and September of last year. And that 51 towns saw increases above that. 3 of those were in, the top 3 were in Chittenden County. And
Not ski towns.
no, the top 3 where the difference. So I'm looking at 2 things. I look at the preponderance of where short-term rentals are, and that's in mostly ski towns. I'm also looking at the percent change, which can be somewhat misleading when you only have a dozen and all of a sudden it goes to 2 dozen. But these are
That
my
is double. I mean,
yeah.
no matter what
Yeah, so this is my last slide to show some of the other information we found about short-term rentals. And I did have 2 final slides that I'm happy to skip over, but if you ever want me back to speak, there's a study, a national study on Black and Hispanic developers showing that this is an underutilized part of our workforce for this committee's interest. And so VHFA has an RFP out now where we are encouraging more BIPOC developers and supporting through funding to build this part, because we need more people to help us solve this.
Right, because your last slide said 0 in Vermont right now.
Currently, they know of 0, but we have already been in conversations. We found many BIPOC homeowners and who have small portfolios of some duplexes, some rentals, who are considering, this instead of going from a side hustle to a real job of doing this.
Great. Well, we're a little bit over time. Of course, we'll have you back. I think you really flattered us with talking about the good work we did in enabling language, but really thank you for demonstrating all the good work and the stories of the people that you've housed. Thank you for listening to our intent and really going above and beyond to meet it. We appreciate that. At some point, of all the things we talked about, I would add to the list that I'm curious about the 5% down program through the federal government for people to buy quadruplexes and start building their portfolio or their income. Might dovetail with the sort of BIPOC developer piece you're talking about. And a big conversation will be housing retention. This year you touched on it, but we know that a lot of your partners are having to develop a wing of their business that's more of a nonprofit devoted to risk assessment and navigating really difficult housing situations. So we're really keenly aware of that. We're having a conversation, joint hearing tomorrow with Human Services and Judiciary to talk more about that. But thank you as always. You're definitely going to be a thought partner throughout this session, and we want to hear your thoughts on all of those studies, et cetera. And I know we'll be having more of a discussion on the rental registry, and I still do feel it's, we are gathering some information from the landlord certificate, and the landlord certificate can be very valuable to a tenant if completed. So it would be nice to put more of a stick in a approach in there. Yes.
Thank you. It's one. Yeah.
Thank
wonderful
you.
to see what she does with our dollars.
Yes. So I'm noticing we don't have a built-in break today. So I would say take one as you need. We have Doug and Charles from 10:30 to 11:30. If we don't need the last few minutes, we'll take a break then. But if you need a break before that, please take one. Thank you so much, Doug, for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for having me.
Yeah.
Does
Yes, Charles, I think that makes sense too.
come up or
I mean, it's up to you both, but we're okay with that. Are we doing a slide? Is that one?
Hi.
Good to see you, Senator.
Good morning. And Charles, what a treat to see you in this new capacity.
yes, and you'll see me on the vices as well.
Well,
Hopefully
can't
not.
forsake those vices. The vices enable.
I need a new one.
So is the screen people are seeing at
She
home
needs a new
us,
one
or
to
is
tap.
it-
On your vice?
Oh,
On your vice?
We're
Okay, okay.
We're
Put some thought
hopeful
into that.
that the sports betting will in fact produce much more than it
That's
has.
not going to the ed fund.
No, that's true, it's not.
So I don't know, I'm sure you've come prepared with, what you want to update us around, and I know we have many questions, so sort of open to how you want to start.
Madam Chair. For the record, Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer for the state of Vermont.
And Charles Martin, I'm the policy director for the recovery office.
So I did share the slide deck from the all-member briefing that just gives an overview of flood efforts at that time, back in December, and gives some general numbers. I may reference that,
Okay.
but I wanted this to be an opportunity for the committee to ask more questions, get more detailed updates on different aspects of their recovery, and also share some, more updates that aren't captured in that more generalized document.
Right.
Also shared a 1.5 to 2 page document that was more financial in nature, that was focused on the size of this disaster, the
Right.
corresponding match needs.
Is that the same one we saw in finance?
Yes.
Okay. So that hasn't, the numbers haven't changed there.
The numbers have not really changed significantly at this point from that 1.5 pager. I would say the one number that, as noted on that document, the numbers are all estimates that are
Right.
subject to fluctuation. Our insurance payments are listed at 40 million estimated on that page. They're currently, we currently have confirmed about 49 million. We don't have all of that money yet, but we have confirmation of intent to pay on about 49 million.
Okay.
And
To whom is that? To the state, municipalities,
to the
businesses,
state,
homeowners?
yes, Senator. Just the state's insurance. I have no visibility into the VLCT insurance process.
Well, you're our chief officer, so we're just thinking you're overseeing it and clear on all of it. Or
So
at least in aspects of it.
I have coordinated with them on process side to make sure that FEMA wasn't, because FEMA did attempt to discount some of their damage claims, saying, oh, this is covered by insurance.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand the VLCT insurance process, so we had to do a reboot with them on how they were going to work in VLCT's insurance process.
Right. Can we pause?
Yes.
I wonder if you all are one-time visitors to the State House today, and if you want to share who you are, why you are sitting in economic development.
You're from the Vermont Studio Center in Johnson.
Yeah.
We have an ice cream social this afternoon from 4 to 6.
Oh, great.
I'm Chloe Boynton. This is
I'm Hope Sullivan. And I'm Beth. Yeah. And
Alright.
yeah, we're very involved in flood, so we figured we'd sit in on that one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, feel free to share your thoughts afterwards.
We're impressed that you have any money for an ice cream social.
There's always money, right? Thanks for being here.
So for the insurance payments, those are positive. They're coming back to the Insurance Reserve Fund, I believe is the name of that fund. And they require emergency board authorization or an act of the General Assembly to move them out of there. The Secretary of Administration can do transfers less than 10,000, but that obviously doesn't matter in a situation like this. At this point, we're not recommending any short-term transfers to the e-board because we want to get in all of the damage for both buildings and contents. So that $50 million roughly is for both the buildings damage and for the contents inside, so furniture, computers, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then we need to reconcile that against our FEMA damage inventory, which has somewhere in the nature of $400 million in it right now.
Yeah.
And decide with FEMA how we're going to best back out and account for those insurance claims before we start to recommend to the e-board how that money be distributed.
Okay. Is that all falling on his team, or is CFR involved?
Most of that work falls on existing state structure. So the
Okay.
Division of Risk Management,
Okay.
it's a small division. I think it actually only has 2 people in it. But they do have a broker on contract that helps them negotiate these types of issues when something like this occurs. So
Okay.
we do have a contracted broker that is making sure we get fair payments on our insurance.
Okay.
And then because of a contract we established during the pandemic, we were able to stand up support for our FEMA application process with Guidehouse for this disaster as well.
Oh.
So we have a supplemental team from them that also helps us reconcile the FEMA and insurance information
Okay.
and make sure that we're, getting every dollar reimbursed that we possibly can.
And they're sort of technical assistance Guidehouse, right?
Yes.
And they are not, I remember in our discussion in Gov Ops, are they also available to our municipalities? Does VLCT have a contract with Guidehouse too?
So VLCT does not. However, with the FEMA process, the state counts as the applicant, and then the municipalities and nonprofits count as sub-applicants. And so Guidehouse is contracting with the state to provide sub-applicant assistance as well.
And
So as long as it's related to a FEMA PA claim, Guidehouse can give them as much support as they need. I think the problem that some municipalities are running into is engineering services, planning for more complex projects. I know Johnson was mentioned, and that's where a particularly complex project is.
right.
We do have a team that's supporting the Johnson wastewater facility.
Yeah.
But we can only give advice and technical support when it comes time to actually procure those engineering studies and keep the plant operating in the short term. There's a lot of burden on the municipality in those situations.
So Doug, who, given what we've all heard from our municipalities, that they don't, particularly the smaller ones without managers and strong paid administrative staff, how do smaller towns know Guidehouse there is a technical resource?
So VEM has, shortly after the disaster, they reached out, well, I think it was a week or two after the rain stopped, because it rained for about 2.5 weeks. And we held a week-long briefings every day for the towns. We tried to get every town that was impacted in there for that briefing, and that offer of additional technical support was issued there. We also sent out multiple emails to try to connect with towns. I do think, we never achieve 100% saturation, unfortunately. But we did try to communicate multiple times in multiple ways through the RPC, the regional planning commissions as well.
Do you know which towns you're just having a really hard time reaching?
So, we did, when we compared the towns that we had mapped damage for based on the floodwater data against the towns that had applied for public assistance, we felt confident that all of the towns had met the goal of having their public assistance claim in.
Okay.
And at this point, we're tracking. So once they put in the request for public assistance, that starts a clock on when their damage inventories have to be submitted. And I believe it's 60 days. So we tracked that deadline, and we're contacting towns that were coming up on their deadline, trying to make sure they were, and then generally speaking, there have been recently just a couple, like 2 or 3 towns that we've been having trouble communicating with. Those have been raised to me, but I think we're also still trying to work through getting those towns to give FEMA everything that they need. The problem in those towns is that FEMA needs a lot from them.
Yeah.
Right. And I know, for instance, Johnson applied to the Municipal Technical Assistance Program, and we are able to approve some additional support for some of the groundwork that's necessary in order to complete some of their FEMA docs that normally they
tracking the hours of a lot of municipal folks, unpaid volunteers. I mean, it would help us moving forward to know the burden that's placed on local communities and what might have been compensated and what remains uncompensated.
Yeah, I think we might have to connect with, we're not tracking that at the state level. We can connect with the League of Cities and Towns, and I can also connect with Sean Sheehan and Jason Goslin. They're the people on my team from Agency Human Services that interface with the volunteer organizations.
Yeah.
And they might have some data on the volunteer hours. The reason we don't have it flow into our process is that volunteer hours, by their very nature, don't show up on FEMA reimbursements, right?
Right.
And that's one thing that we definitely saw in stark relief this time around, was that many of the volunteer EMDs that ended up working hundreds of hours, they ended up volunteering hundreds of hours.
Right.
Because they were volunteers, the town is not able to start paying them and then ask for FEMA reimbursement because they weren't paid before the event. FEMA always looks for those things where you start paying someone you weren't. And if it was a volunteer position, they don't support switching that.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be anytime soon, but in the post-mortem, when we know as many of the dollars, et cetera, as we can, it would be helpful to know how much uncompensated labor went into this.
Absolutely, Madam Chair. Vermont Emergency Management, I'm trying to be good about acronyms, is going to be doing after-action reviews. Now, their after-action reviews tend to focus on the emergency management structure.
Okay.
And we're going to make sure that we loop in other angles like this, other aspects, to try to make sure we're doing a more holistic review, and not just how did the local EM interface with the local emergency manager interface with the state emergency manager.
Thanks.
So at this point, we've been following the towns as they're submitting their damage inventories, and none of the towns it hasn't been escalated to me. We've been tracking it, and none of it has been escalated to me as a town missing their major milestones for a complete damage inventory. Our total damage submitted to FEMA right now is fluctuating in the low 600 millions. So that includes state, it includes municipal, it does not include federal highways. So anything that is agency of transportation that's handled through federal highways is not in that number. The last time I looked at that number, it was about 150 million. Yeah. The other thing, importantly for this committee in particular, it doesn't include is the damage to businesses and individuals.
I was going to say, business is a big missing piece.
We did try hunting for some data on the individual side, and there is a gap there. The only damage that FEMA records and stores is the damage that they approve for reimbursement.
Wow.
So their damage is listed in the low 20 millions.
Yeah.
As individual.
And what
damage.
do they include in their notion of damage?
So
remind us.
It generally has to be structural damage that's required to live there. It can be personal property, but it has to be personal property that's required to continue to live comfortably, right? So if you have a lot of things that are very valuable to you, or very valuable in general, and they're destroyed, FEMA very well may not reimburse that because they don't look at it as a necessity.
Yeah.
Like inventory.
Yes.
I know it's almost an impossible task, but in the post-mortem, somewhere between what they consider reimbursable and like the 211 calls and all of the damage reported, it would be nice to know the unmet need.
We did try to look at the 211 data as a source.
Yeah.
And that ended up not being particularly useful.
Okay.
But yes, we are now going to be pursuing looking at working with the Department of Financial Regulation and seeing if anything that's even partially useful can come in related to insurance claims.
Right.
Because if we know that a small percentage, and Commissioner Gaffney would be much better able to speak to the details here, but we know that the minority or a small percentage of homeowners have flood insurance.
Right.
And
very small.
Right. So we might be able to extrapolate from the percentage that had flood insurance, but as you know, when you have smaller percentages, extrapolation gets much less reliable.
Right.
So that's a bit of a challenge for us there on the individual side. And on the business side in particular, the Small Business Administration program, if you look at who they actually give loans to, much more, over 90% of their volume is going to individuals. Yeah. Their loan structure generally didn't seem to function very well for most businesses because it had a viability requirement in it that if you just got hit with a flood and you're not certain you'll be able to, you can't make the
Yeah.
numbers work and you need a loan to help make the numbers work and
Yeah.
help try to recover. The viability requirement in the SBA loans
Okay, SBA,
was
yeah,
a hurdle.
right.
So,
I heard SBA was not very helpful.
last time I looked, it was 50 or less. It was very
Total, wow.
small number of regular SBA loans. The economic injury disaster loans, there were some more of those, but many, many more individual loans from the SBA than to businesses.
Okay.
So
If I
that
were to
data
ask
set,
a question,
yes.
how much did Vermonters lose from the July flood? And you started adding up all the things that you're able to quantify right now, there would be a lot that you wouldn't know.
Yes.
Right.
And it would be almost impossible to estimate it, wouldn't it?
It is. I've done some research trying to compare this disaster to other disasters, trying to find ways to fill in some of those blank spots on the model. And it seems like a persistent problem that individual and business losses and disasters are rarely comprehensively quantified. There's a very high threshold at which FEMA will go in and do a comprehensive analysis of the losses to business and individuals. But they look at that on the size of the disaster, like relative to the nation and not per capita relative to Vermont. So like, I believe the fires in Maui are likely to trigger that type of evaluation. But for our disaster, the total losses of it being less than $1 billion, I don't know their exact threshold, but I was told that they don't go in and do that analysis for a disaster as small as ours.
$1 billion being considered small, that's sort of the threshold.
Yes, I cannot remember who produced the chart, but there was an interesting chart that I saw recently that showed the number of billion-dollar disasters. And it's trending. It was, it was the state climatologist in a presentation to House Environment and Transportation.
Yeah.
And she was showing the number of billion-dollar disasters and it trending upward every year.
Yeah.
It's a helpful chart to just confirm what I think we all know when we turn on the news now, that FEMA's inundated with requests regularly, and I don't think they're going to change their.
Do you have any information as far as reported tax losses in the aggregate?
Not yet, but after April 15th, we might be able to have some preliminary or partial data. After the October 15th filing deadline, that will get us a much better set, because I would also assume if someone has been, had their life either significantly disrupted or nearly destroyed by the flood, they're probably going to want an extension to get all their paperwork in order. They're going to need that extra time. And also our more complex, more higher income filers generally file towards the extended due date. But I do think the tax department might have some data towards the end of 2024. Yeah, it's a frustrating lag there. And I'm honestly, I'm trying to think through the federal schedules, and I'm not certain how much detail will be there, because sometimes if you are not able to deduct all of those losses, a business would, but so it might be more useful on the business income side.
So, yeah, may I just tack on it? So to tack on to Randy's thought, I wonder, and looking at Charles' former hat, I wonder if you could partner with our chambers to actually begin to get those totals, particularly for the businesses that we may not be seeing all the business loss. And for this committee, that's an important figure for us to be seeing. I wonder, chambers, my guess, that have a pretty good sense of their numbers.
We might be able to formalize that more. I know the Central Vermont Chamber estimated over 300 million
Yeah.
of loss from the flood, which I find to be looking at the scale and the number of properties impacted, pretty credible. And we have data from the BGAP, the Business Emergency Gap Assistance
Right.
Program. ACCD is compiling that. So I think we will actually have better data on the business side than on the individual side.
Oh,
So,
Were you gonna, I think to round out that page and a half, kind of a financial assessment, there's a match that
yes.
we're required to put into, to unlock the FEMA
yeah,
funding.
25%, right?
So right now, the match is at 25%. Once we officially cross 112.4 million obligated with FEMA, then we go into the 90-10. So our match goes down to a 10% requirement. Because we anticipate our FEMA public assistance coming in at somewhere in the nature of 570 million after we deduct insurance, we don't see a path where we don't get that 10% match rate.
Okay.
It would be very, very unusual for FEMA to not approve that, and I think we would engage pretty strenuously with our congressional delegation if it seemed like they weren't going to do that. Once we hit that threshold, we're expecting them to adjust the obligation rate.
So, but this points out one of the biggest challenges is that everybody's got to float themselves until we
Yes.
get that. So, you know, this is a huge financial challenge for both us as a state, for individuals, for businesses. All of us have to float the recovery and then wait to get reimbursed.
Right.
It's really
Right.
tough.
The towns.
If you zero in on just the municipalities for a moment, the estimated match just for the immediate repairs and mitigation is in the realm of 20 million.
Okay.
So because the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund was established and improved after Irene,
Yeah.
the average that the state covers is about 50% of that. So roughly 10 million will be paid by municipalities, 10 million will be paid by the state. However, that full 20 million is paid by the municipalities, and then once their project is done, the state reimburses them for their share.
Yeah.
They get between 30 and 70% based on how many hazard mitigation related flags they have checked, or boxes they have checked, which I think I'll be blunt. I think that was done with the best of intentions, but I do think we need to reevaluate that practice because when I talk to communities, they say, it's not like we don't want to have done this. We just don't know how, and we don't have the time, and we're barely able to keep up with our normal functions. So I recognize the practice of, rewarding good behavior. But rewarding good behavior tends to reward the communities with more resources and who can afford to behave better. And so we do see that there's a pretty strong correlation between towns with a higher match rate, where they're only paying for 30% of their match, and having those town managers, those more professional staff. And I do think in the wake of something like this, it's a time to look and say, is this really the most appropriate structure? And that's one reason we are pursuing, at this point, actually, we're not sure if it's going to either be a FEMA grant or an Economic Development Agency grant, but to partner with UVM and look at our regional structuring and our regional division of responsibilities related to, mostly in the context of disaster response and recovery and economic recovery. And because we've seen many instances where going from state all the way down to local just has created many disconnects. And I know in a situation where the local volunteer emergency manager was just out in the community helping people for 10 days straight, and wasn't answering emails, wasn't getting phone calls, because they were helping people, and
or wasn't going to work.
Right, and they weren't working either. So I do think looking at how we're organized is merited at this point.
Is that going to be part of sorry, is that gonna be part of your recommendation to the GovOps committees? Who
So
does that work?
I have been talking about it with Senate GovOps. Generally, yes, I think that would be a Senate GovOps question.
Right.
So just, we can rethink that, not, I mean, FEMA. Anyway,
Yes,
about that.
I
I mean, I'm
think-
not sure which comes first, but chicken or the egg here.
exactly, Senator. I think, you know, Vermont has been organized in this manner for hundreds of years, and it's not something that could be changed, I think, in a single session.
Right.
So I think at a minimum, it needs to be studied. There needs to be a, you know, decision control process put in place as to how it's brought forward.
I think some of our past witnesses would just want to make sure that it's noted that a lot of nonprofits and the United Ways and the Montpelier Lives stepped up and filled that gap. And some of them don't feel like they're part of the retrospective right now. They don't feel like they've been brought into the mix of what the future regional solutions look like. So,
Madam Chair, that's fair, and I would say that's primarily because those regional, that regional after action review hasn't been organized yet.
Right.
I have gotten the ball rolling on having our regional recovery officers. We have three of them right now, and they're going to start pulling people together to start having those conversations. The long-term recovery groups and the philanthropic entities, the nonprofits, will definitely be part of that process.
And you're adding more regionally, aren't you? With regional agents?
Not yet, Senator, but we have been working with USDA Rural Development to see if there are opportunities for the federal government to also do things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
They've been great partners in that conversation. Nothing is finalized yet, but I think there is a potential to get more resources to at least supplement the recovery.
right. Is there any role for the Boston Fed in all of this? Like, are they part of the conversation? I mean, interest rates, the cost of things, the way we don't often know what other states are doing. You know, there were moments where I thought, God, can we talk to the Fed? You know, do they have ideas that we haven't leveraged?
That's an interesting question, Madam Chair. I can take that back. It certainly seems like worth consulting with them. Yes.
Yeah.
I think we have seen, you know, the treasurer partnering
Right.
and with the governor and doing that $15 million program to help municipalities. But I've already said a number that's larger than 15 million as far as what the towns are going to have to flow. So that's certainly not a complete solution. I don't think it was ever sold as a complete solution, but we were trying to help in the interim. We also are trying to navigate a FEMA program called the Community Disaster Loan Program that helps municipalities that have suffered revenue loss. So far, we're still trying to see if we can have any communities that program makes sense for. It's a pretty complex program, and
it's a loan that they're taking.
It's a loan. It is forgivable. It's really designed for. It's like most things in FEMA. It's designed for the southern structure and the southern way of gathering revenue at the local level. So it doesn't necessarily work perfectly for Vermont, but we still might be able to. It still might be able to help a couple of our communities.
Right. As we know, our communities are going to suffer a big revenue gap. Municipalities, state too.
Yeah, Barry lost a huge percentage of its grand list.
Right.
Yeah. And revenue, the key ones are grand list, parking, and.
Oh, yeah, revenue.
Yeah.
Parking, local option taxes.
Yeah.
Because everything was shut down.
Property, yeah.
Loss of the grand list. And they're floating all the buyouts the towns have to float.
Yep.
Right.
Which goes to my earlier frustration.
Right. If you do even rough napkin math there were about 260 structures, and this is really on the individual side, that were substantially damaged, meaning 50% or more. if your structure was 50% or more damaged in the recent flood, you're going to seriously at least be considering a buyout if your municipality is aligned. That translates to at least $50 million of grant list value, which, about a third of that, a little bit more than a third, was concentrated in Washington County. So I think that's particularly exacerbating it. It's interesting how the different types of damage, like Johnson and Ludlow, of course, had extremely expensive wastewater facility damage, which rivals the damage to, just in monetary value, rivals the structural damage. A complicated problem to solve, but at least it's only one structure and one financial problem.
Yeah.
With those, an entire neighborhood in the north end of Barre being flooded, you really have to approach each of those landowners and see what each of those landowners wants to do. And the rough rental proportion in Barre is about 50% of properties are rental properties. So about half of those structures aren't eligible for the homeowner version of a buyout, and it's much more complicated to do a buyout with a business.
Yeah.
We do them, it's possible, but individual buyouts are already frustratingly long to accomplish, and business ones are even more challenging.
Was there any other major topics that you wanted to cover broadly before we? I'm asking that because I'd like to hear you all reflect on our housing bill, our permit reform work, and if there are barriers that you're seeing right now that add cost or time to the work you're trying to help communities do, that you want to highlight for us in our permit bill.
And I had a question that might tie into that, which is, I know we've got people living in housing they shouldn't be living in. Are we keeping track of all that 46, the whole neighborhood in Barre that went down? Where are those people going? Some of them have probably lived in Barre their entire life. It's hard to take a buyout if you don't have any place to go. And are we tracking it?
Yeah, I would say that the answer is yes, we have been tracking that. And we've been keeping as close of a connection with people as we've been able to. So we've focused on reaching out to all the households that reported that their heating systems that they reported substantial damage to their homes. Then we asked them, is your heating system working? In October, I believe, we started asking, maybe it was September, October timeframe. It's a little bit blurry, but we asked, do you need help getting your heating system up? And we helped over 200 households get to completion, get their homes working again. The number of homes that out of that subset that were just beyond immediate repair were at least in the realm of 17 or so that just were not able to be repaired in the short term before the winter. Now, some of those individuals were eligible for the direct housing program from FEMA. We had just in the high 20s of households that were in the general assistance program after the flood. Some of those households were reluctant to engage with FEMA, and we did as much as we could to encourage them to apply for FEMA assistance. I would say that, and then we stood up a bridge case manager team to help connect with households and try to find the right solution for them. And mostly those were state employees that were they volunteered to be reassigned from their regular duties, and they were just trying to help people not fall off the radar, right? Just trying to keep track of them. In August, we had applied for a grant with FEMA for disaster case management, which is really the way that you keep your connection with those households. And Capstone is the main subrecipient on that, working with CVOEO and the other community action agencies. And that team, I believe it still needs to be filled out, but the start of that team was actually able to be launched. They were able to hire enough people to to launch that team, and we've begun transitioning cases to them. And they are also, you know, using the new software, trying to connect with those households. It has been frustrating for households because in trying to stay connected to them, you know, someone from FEMA has visited them, and then someone from our bridge team, and someone from a local nonprofit and they feel like they keep getting handed off to different people. And to be honest, that's because they have been getting handed off to different people, right? Now that we've got higher bridge, not bridge any longer, but disaster case managers, they'll be able to be that long-term connection point for those households that still need help recovering.
Does it make sense for us to hear from one of them? Have they started their work in earnest? Because I'd be curious their experience trying to help people find housing or, you know, get back on their feet, if it's out of the county, if it's out of the state.
I do think it makes sense to hear from Sue Minter. I mean, you know, with her experience from the previous
Always,
flood.
yes.
Who carries the water for the rest of the camp agency.
So she's been driving that. She's been driving it as quickly as she possibly could.
Okay.
Hiring conditions are not ideal right now, so you know, it of course took all of us longer to start the transition than we'd like. But I would say Capstone has done everything they possibly could to stand up that team.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have Sue, I think, just on a shorter witness list.
It's Barry up and Barry when they were in here, they said they were sending out counselors who wasn't working with individual families, and I know they've been working with Capstone.
Yes.
Seneca too.
I did phone calls at Capstone.
Okay.
Yeah, because SEPCA also.
Yeah.
Sue's the visionary. Sue is, it's always good to have her in the right place at the right time.
She just has more energy than anybody.
She has a lot of energy. She's great.
So from what I've seen, one reflection, and this can go into the other aspects that you wanted to talk about, Madam Chair, is that there were multiple elements of this, some elements of this disaster that were made worse by how we are organized, how we talk to each other. Not how hard people were trying, not how good people's intentions were, but by just the organizational structure of the state of Vermont itself. And when I say state, I mean...
Can I put a pin in that?
Yeah.
What was the key missing piece? I mean, was it county government? Because I think FEMA's always saying, well, you don't have county government, it makes it hard for us. But is that actually... How do we not communicate, given how small we are? How are we not able to de-silo enough to be effective? And is county government actually the missing piece to making us more effective?
I think regional organization,
Better regional.
beyond planning,
Right.
regional organization of authority and responsibility
Right.
is the missing element. County government is one approach, and county government is what FEMA understands. I would
Right.
also say county government is where federal dollars are linked.
Right.
So the fact that we don't have county government means we missed out on millions of
Yes.
dollars
There you know.
in bill.
There's
Bipartisan
also the
infrastructure
issue
law.
of communications, which
Yes.
we've heard repeatedly, is the ability for small communities to know what the next community near them and the community before that, in terms of flood flow and so on. People
Yeah.
didn't know what was happening, and there's no mechanism to alert.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, this is random, but I remember when I was the student body president at UVM, so bear with me, but as part of your accreditation as an institution of higher education, every year you had to make a pandemic plan. We had to talk about if, you know, bodies were going to be piled up on the ice rink, you know, and like, I mean, it was I remember it very well. It was very morbid, and it was right before H1N1 actually. So it felt useful in retrospect, but you know, you have to keep updating your planning, and even the student body president has to know what the plan is every year because they're key to talking to students. So is there some hook for municipalities and for every entity that needs to have a plan to say, to get X, Y, and Z, you have to update this every year? And, you know, somewhere in the middle of the flood recovery, I was going to UVM's warehouse full of cleaning supplies and pandemic supplies they were never gonna use, that they were saying like, we could absolutely give this to folks in flood recovery, but no one's contacted us.
Yeah, I would say, so the state has an internal similar to that. They have a continuity of operations plan that work very well for internal purposes. As far as incentivizing the development of those procedures and practices at the local level, government is much more complex now. It's much more complex than it was even 10 years ago.
Right.
And if you add up all of the baseline activities that a government has to form, and that our common perception is that the government should provide those for people, and then you compare those against the grand list of that municipality and their ability to raise taxes to pay for staff,
Right.
I think the two just don't line up.
Right.
I think that's I believe that's what we're seeing in a lot of our smaller communities, is that to perform a lot of those tasks, they would either need much more volunteer time, and a lot of them are already run by volunteers, or they would need disproportionately high tax rates, which were always in the top 5 of property taxes in the country. So there's very little capacity for people to pay more property taxes.
So are you thinking about some kind of regional entities that could acquire federal funds to do this work?
That is what I'd like to look at with,
GovOps is gonna be looking at that.
so GovOps, the bill that's yes, they're gonna be looking at it. The bill right now would, create basically a commission. And my hope would be to engage with UVM, perform the study to provide the commission with more information.
Okay.
I don't want to overstate here. I don't think the administration hasn't signed on or isn't completely supportive of the exact wording of GovOps' current bill, right?
Well, yes, we know.
Right.
It's just the beginning.
Right. It's just the first step, and I do think,
But what you're saying about regional organizations supports the fact that we need to be looking at regional organization.
yes, I do think.
What it is, we'll see.
But I think, just having driven my county after the flood, we had a couple things. We had one shelter. And in a thing like a flood, you can't get to the shelter. The police said, well, you could, but I guess they know all the back roads. So we didn't have any local shelters. If people had to evacuate, they didn't know where to go except Barry, and you couldn't get there. The whole water is coming kind of town to town communications. We don't seem to know how well our emergency management directors in each town are trained. I know the bigger towns send people to Maryland, I think, for training. Small towns don't. And I think it was Johnson said, well, it's usually a member of the select board, and that usually turns over every couple of years, so you don't have anybody with experience. And just that whole communications system, and we seem to be spending millions of dollars in cell towers and stuff for emergency communications, but it didn't show up. So we need a lot better pre-planning. And there's models. I mean, if you live near the ocean, there's evacuation routes, there's, robocalls that come through to tell you what's happening, where to go, and when to do it. And we need to be better coordinated than that.
So, and speaking of which, in our last 10 minutes, I'd like to just go back to, we have this major, carrot and stick operation that we're potentially unfolding with the designation program and with, updates to Act 250 and where there might be exemptions. And we've had an ongoing philosophical conversation about land banks, well before the flood. But is this a time for, the Natural Resource Board or someone to say, okay, you're asking for Tier 1A or Tier 1B exemption. we need to make sure you have, you know, land set aside for FEMA trailers when, you know, disaster strikes. We need, you know, you need to, you have municipal water and sewer here you don't want to use for housing, but it has to be available in an emergency. Like, should we be asking communities to do this now because we're looking at a major overhaul of our relationship with municipalities vis-a-vis development?
I think the ask for the municipalities to do that extra work, I think you'd want to look at where it would make sense for the community to be able to provide that themselves, and where we're going to help them with that.
Right.
So I think communities below a certain size, you might not want to require that, or you might want to have a way to provide them with that, with help in getting there.
Right.
I would recommend that if that were the conversation, that it would be Vermont Emergency Management
Okay.
that would be reviewing those plans and approaches. I
Right.
mean, that's who does our state hazard mitigation plan and
Right.
emergency management plan.
I mean, and granted, you know, Act 250 doesn't do that for anybody right now, but when does anyone interface with the state that we should be saying, by the way, you haven't updated your map to show, like, in a disaster, you have to move people here. You know, like, what, we have to find a way to just make that a routine.
Well, and encourage every town has an emergency plan.
Right.
And getting everybody to review it on an annual basis, and the volunteers engaged so that they know how to get to the emergency shelter, set it up, get it active and going. I think that that is one way. It's the sort of the lethargy that, you know, once we're done and through the disaster, how do we keep everybody's interest engaged, and how do we get the emergency managers better trained on a regular basis?
Well, and just, you know, how do we make sure we're not giving FEMA trailers back because
Yes,
we
which
didn't
just-
know where to put them? You know,
Exactly.
like that just shouldn't.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
has to water, and
Well-
sewer, and electricity.
Yeah.
Well, Hardwick put their hand up the other day in committee.
Right.
I mean, there are,
No, I spent all weekend trying to get 10 FEMA trailers back to the Northeast Kingdom that wants them, but they're already spoken for by another state. So they're leaving.
did we know that there was a time limit on those FEMA trailers being asked for?
No, there wasn't a time limit. So what happened was the direct housing program, normally, and this would take even longer than what we saw happen after our event. FEMA would go through tier by tier. They would look at their direct lease program, then they would look at their multifamily housing and repair. And they would only look at that community FEMA trailer solution after the other two had been exhaustively ruled out. They started all three at the same time this time. And then at the last minute, right before we were about to break ground on the Montpelier location, the team that was working on the direct lease program came back and said, we found a place to site all 20 families at that point, was about what it had gone down to. And that's why we lost the Vermont Montpelier group site, was
Because we actually found places.
because the
Yes,
Montpelier
that-
group site would have
right.
been like $30 million or something like that for FEMA to build.
So
And so
where,
it was much more cost effective for FEMA, so they canceled the group site and honored the lease with Montpelier.
But there's unmet need that somehow just
Yes.
wasn't kind of, you know,
Yes.
from Southern Vermont and the Northeast.
yeah.
Yes, and we've been trying to dig in on that and trying to dispute that with FEMA all along. I think
Okay.
Or was that an unmet need that wasn't applied for or asked for?
No, I think so there have definitely been individuals that have stopped engaging with FEMA or didn't engage with FEMA in the first place. And sympathetically, it is difficult. There's a lot of work that goes into keeping your eligibility with FEMA going, right? You have to do a lot of paperwork. Even the FEMA leadership admits it's a lot of paperwork. And so if a bureaucrat is admitting it's a lot of paperwork, you know it's really a lot of paperwork. So some people chose not to continue with that, and our bridge case managers didn't really have the skill sets to help them with that process. the disaster case managers at Capstone, they've been hired to have and trained to have those skills. However, for some people, it's already too late. They've already made the decision to walk away or didn't engage with FEMA. And in other cases, they found places to live, but they were temporary solutions. And I think it's challenging to have those conversations with FEMA. If you tell them you're living somewhere safe, even if it's with a family member, you kind of go off the list, and they're like, well, tell us if you become,
Even if it's temporary.
even tell us if you become homeless.
So the state can't say like, build this anyway, because we know people need it.
Right.
They have to hear from individual impacted families.
Yes. Yeah. The state unfortunately had no, we had a data sharing agreement, so we were able to get some after the fact data from FEMA, but we have no direct involvement or control in the housing programs like direct housing that FEMA runs. So we were something of a bystander in that, which was unfortunate.
I know, Jeffrey Lubell, who's spoken before, he's the national housing expert, and he'd like to come back in to talk about, having a place in the state for manufacturing multifamily housing, that more states are doing this through a business model that's, developing with the technology, but also it might be important, like replacing some of the National Guard functions of just setting up kind of temporary tents, et cetera, to actually be able to manufacture multifamily housing quickly.
Well, we have places that are manufacturing a whole bunch of different types of housing in the state. I mean, but I thought where you were going with that is, given that we'd identified a place where we might have put and relocated people, it strikes me Vermont just needs a place that we can, on a regular basis now, with regular disasters, easily and quickly have housing, temporary housing available for people to quickly move to. I mean, it strikes me that would be worth developing, given what's coming at us.
Right. Yeah.
Which is sort of where I thought you were
Well,
going with that, but
it's similar because, we're not producing emergency housing.
Create something that is temporary housing that would be there for an emergency,
yes,
when we have a desperate need for housing right now.
absolutely. We
How
have
would we do
need
that?
for both. We have need for both, Randy.
Well, we can't do the first. I don't know how we do the second as well,
Yeah.
given our capability and.
I'm just saying, we needed that housing in
Yeah,
July.
but it just doesn't sound like a.
I know. I think we should be exploring all of them.
We're getting low on time, but yes, yeah.
So, try to be brief. The other main area I saw was, of course, hooked in directly into this, that the human impacts, the mental health impacts, the human safety impacts of the disaster were so much worse. They were magnified by the fact that we did not have any vacancy rate, that we did not have anywhere for them to go. FEMA's standard process is to give up to 18 months of rental assistance, which in most states works, right? Because they can give rental assistance, they can find a place to live. It's not ideal, but they can find someplace safe to live. In our state, that we know that solution just was not working.
Right.
And anyone who found a rental place was likely, potentially displacing someone else who needed housing.
It was more of an option with Irene, but
Yes.
not now.
Yes, our rental market, our vacancy rates were very, very different after Irene than they are right now. So we've had population growth, and we haven't had the corresponding housing growth, and particularly haven't had housing growth in resilient fashion. So one thing we do support, resiliency investment areas. It's an element of H627 that Rep. Sims and Rep. Dolan have introduced. I think that we need to come up with ways to facilitate more investments in those areas that we know are not going to be sprawl, right? They're going to be development that is relying on existing infrastructure or reasonable expansions of existing infrastructure, either in areas that have much lower disaster risk, whether it's landslide, whether it's flood, and also looking at ways to improve and mitigate our historic downtowns. I think we can't abandon them. We do need to think of how we're going to continue to use those spaces. I think actually, if you look at Venice, the way that they use their first floor of their structures is very different than it was 50 years ago, right? but they're still using those spaces. They're still living and working and shopping in those spaces. So there are ways to adapt. And I think our downtowns, even if we find significant floodplain mitigation, which we will be doing those regional discussions looking at floodplain mitigation, even if we do that, we don't know that we're going to be able to significantly reduce the risk to our downtowns. And even if we did all of the right things, our climate is changing in ways we can't predict, and our flood risk could still increase, even if we open up more floodplain.
Does that piece of H627 have a big price tag with it?
The element of H627 doesn't have a price tag. It focuses on just the designation aspect and doesn't get into what we do with that designation. I think one thing in our clean water spending and our state programs, we do move a good amount of money, and there is a lot of federal money flowing over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
So part of it could be how we reorganize our priorities and what investments we prioritize instead of adding new investments.
So you'd be interested in seeing that piece move as a way to give the task force a tool to get flexibility in these areas and bring resources.
Right, and I know we have so many different names and layers and designations, but I do think, and it is very similar to growth centers, but I don't think growth centers necessarily have a resiliency element, and so there could be other ways.
No, I
think they will now.
But I think Designation 2050 kind of failed in capturing the flood experience and bringing that into their proposal. So I think this is valuable as we look at the designation study. Thank you. I'm sure we'll have you back in, but really in the meantime, as this bill takes shape, please do be in touch about this works, this doesn't work. And I think we're looking for just checkpoints with our communities to say what's going to happen in the next disaster, because it's coming faster than every 10 years.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Although every 6 months is.
Hi, Joan. So we're transitioning to Commissioner Goldstein. Again, we have 25 minutes left. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning.
We'll see you at ice cream.
Good morning, and thank you. Sorry that I'm not there. I've had this terrible cold cough for like 2 weeks and didn't want to infect anybody. So I'm not sure. I didn't hear all of the previous testimony. I'm not sure how much of this was gone over, but perhaps I'll just do what the conceptual idea is and you stop me. Is that
know the need. I think we've gone over the needs, but the areas that were hard hit are really struggling to figure out how to build the revenue to meet the need.
Right. So this idea came to us from a municipality that had some damage and was concerned that the damaged property will either go off of the tax rolls and they'll lose housing units if the only option for those properties is a FEMA buyout. And so the idea is to give some municipalities the power to influence that outcome just a bit, right? And so how to do that? If we consider the investment area as not a designation process per se, but more like identifying areas that either were damaged and can be rebuilt upon, but need mitigation measures in an effort for the municipality to help that developer out with the mitigation measures, the purchase and or a mitigation measure and or a public improvement all get tied together as something that municipality could bond for. And then once the private development happens, with the increment, a portion of the increment can be used to pay back the debt that the municipality incurred. And so we analyze it and we say, okay, if we do nothing, there's going to be a loss to Ed Fund revenues as these properties get reevaluated or as they get into FEMA buyout. In this scenario, we could reap the benefit, the municipality could reap the benefit of that private development happening by participating in it, by helping that development pencil out. And the other option is if they cannot rebuild at all in some of these damaged properties, they identify an area elsewhere in the municipality where they can develop multi-unit housing or relocate industrial property. So that's our kind of version of disaster resilient investment area, so that these areas are identified. We know what the damaged properties are. We know which municipalities would have been talking to private developers to make housing available, so that municipalities don't lose the revenue and they don't lose the housing units.
So Joan, are you building on Doug's proposed resiliency investment areas? Is that what this is a?
This is, it's one and the same. It's one, it's one and the same, if I'm using the terminology correctly. I know that resiliency investment area is mentioned in H627, but without this TIF-like mechanism.
Okay.
So the idea is that where are we going to find this resiliency money?
Right.
And in our scenario, it's a mechanism where the municipality borrows that money.
But both, like, what is the eligibility for both? Did you have to be impacted in July? Do you just have to want to plan better?
I think BEM really kind of knows the municipalities either most impacted or most vulnerable, because it's not just about past, but it's also for future. And so this is not something that would be standalone. We'd have to do this in conjunction with emergency management, A&R, et cetera. If somebody needs to not only identify those areas that would be eligible, but also identify which mitigation measures passed muster. And then there's a financial viability to say, okay, does this proposed development actually provide enough cash flow for debt service?
So is there and I'm sorry, I know, so just to clarify for the committee and make sure everyone's okay with it, I have given Joan and Jess at ACCD permission to talk to Ellen, and this section would look similar to what Representative Marcotte has introduced on the House side for our consideration. I'm looking at Senator Cummings because I think we talked about it being okay to look at this as part of our.
Yeah, you can look at it. I'm just hard pressed to do anything to the Ed Fund at this point.
Right. So I guess that leads to my question, without having the language in front of us, how is it contained? Is it a certain number each year? How do we make sure this is, manageable from the Ed Fund perspective?
Yeah, so we just got the language over this morning to Ellen, so I believe just sent it over to Ellen, so you'll have an idea of the scope. But as for limitations, at our writing, we did not limit it just because there is so much need all around. But I'm not saying we're not open to that. We needed to get the concept out there and we could talk about it. And there's probably somebody somewhere, maybe it's tax or VEM has a sense of what's the total number of parcels impacted. We could compare and contrast what kind of impact that has on Ed Fund versus, if we don't do something like this, or what would it cost to go and get a resiliency fund? There's a number of analyses that probably could be done to figure out how to best, be a prudent approach,
I'm just concerned that we always, when we're trying to do something without putting any actual money into it, that we always hit the Ed Fund. And there's no buy-in from any of the other funds, mostly the general fund. And right now we have TIFs, but there's also a hard push for many TIFs, and now there's a hard push to do these blighted area freezes. And I'm looking at an 18 to 20% property tax increase, and I'm just struggling with this. we could raise money in other ways.
I think, so with that program and this one, if we do look at it and we consider limiting its scope, I think you were just saying this, Joan, but we'd maybe start with properties that have very little value on the grand list if nothing is done to them. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Although I guess the catalyst for this and any town would be whether or not there is a private developer interested in investing in the area. So we, you know, let's say we all agree to this and we say, great, let it go. Obviously, it takes a long time to do this type of thing. You need to attract the private investment. And we're viewing this very much like a tool, similar to we increased the number of TIFs, but that didn't mean the floodgates opened and everyone created a TIF, right? So it's a similar idea in that take-up will take some time. It's just going to depend on, you know, and I don't know if you do the sort by those most damaged, like obviously those are most in need, but is it also the area where investment wants to happen? Is there a private developer lined up? So all of that has to be part of the eligibility, is like how the private plan measures up, you know? It couldn't be that somebody could just do this, right? They really would have to show that there's interest.
Is this separate from or the same as, we had a program introduced here the other day that if you built a new home in blighted areas, so if I decided I was going to buy a lot cheap in Barry and build a home up on stilts there, I would get my property tax frozen?
So it's something that couldn't be done in conjunction. You couldn't have both. It would have to be one or the other, right? So if you had this disaster resiliency TIF.
So there is another program that would also impact the ed fund.
I think in that case, it's frozen, so it's a little bit different. Whereas in this case, there's still a percentage that does go to the ed fund. And that this would impact multiple properties, whereas my understanding of the other is that it's property by property. So, I mean, I guess it's like, it's sort of like when you think about the whole disaster across the board, there's going to be some towns that are going to be more adept and ready to do a TIF-like structure, others not so much, but they still want to help out that particular individual property owner to do something right on their property. So in a way, it can cover it can cover all bases. You just can't do both at the same time. You couldn't have a disaster TIF and also have a freeze.
No, I'm just trying to see how it works. So it would be for taxation purposes for the ed fund, it would be frozen at that rate for X period of time, for as long as the bond was for 5 years, for a 5-year bond. Is that right?
So I think you're talking about the tax freeze, which I'm not prepared to talk about, but for
the municipality bonds, yeah.
The municipality bonds. Go ahead.
You envision the property tax being frozen for 5 years there, or for as long as the life of the bond exists?
The property tax is not frozen. What happens is any incremental revenue coming from that redeveloped property, a portion of it would go to what we'll call the disaster fund, right? And all that is meant to do is that money is used to help pay the bond back by the town. So it's not, the tax isn't frozen. What is
it's
in
abeyance?
Correct. A portion. It's not 100%. I think right now in TIF it's 75%. So same thing with the municipal tax. They still tax it. They still, you know, it'll be an increment that they'll get to keep part of it. So it's not 100%. Right. With that's separate and distinct from the tax freeze that you're talking about, where it is indeed frozen.
So I guess I would, you know, we have JFO looking at both of these as well to understand their impact. I still leave it, you know, in a way to Senator Cummings. I think we could have a conversation about both in terms of their value to economic development and housing, and recognize that that conversation could take a different turn in finance. As long as Senator Cummings, you're okay with.
I am fine with it. I haven't heard any proposals coming out for how to solve the 18% problem.
Right.
And now we're just going to be and
Exactly.
we're talking about affordability.
Right.
And in Barry and Montpelier, we're probably looking at a 25% property tax increase, which
Right.
most of us can't afford.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to talk about
Yes.
limiting the money coming into the fund
Right.
when the fund is in
Yeah.
distress.
No, we don't want to exacerbate
Yes.
the economic impact towns are already reeling from.
But we could have the policy conversation in here, get through town meeting day, and the conversation could be very different in finance. But I suppose in that context, any more questions for the commissioner about how this would function, sort of, in terms of economic development?
I think I'd feel better about it if there were a plan that said, we've got a developer that is going to come in and take that whole north end of Barry and do something with it.
The governor kind of proposed
The governor
that,
had a
right?
plan for tearing everything down and putting high-rise apartments somewhere at the back end,
Yeah.
but there was no money attached to it.
Okay.
And no guarantee that all of those neighbors would want
To do
to
that.
sell their
Right,
homes, which if you
right.
go to Barry, they have one home standing up in the middle of their whole flood
Yeah.
mitigation that would not sell.
Okay.
So there's a lot of pieces that have to come together.
Right.
Right, and we agree with that, we understand that, and that's why it's not as if everyone is approved on this. Even if this legislation were to go through, each municipality would have to come forward with the redevelopment plan, who is a developer. It's not necessarily that the state's going to drive that.
Right. You're expecting the municipalities and the developers to drive that.
Correct.
I wish we had like a whole corral of developers ready to unleash. I think we have some.
Also.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
that's
even if we did, remembering that there is no other source truly for mitigation to the measures that we would have to do in some of these areas. And so it's just a mechanism, it's a tool that they could tap into. And, appreciate the comment on Ed Fund, but the only way really is to build, right? To try to recollect those revenues. And this is really like an investment in that, so that 20 years hence, we will have built up properties and be able to collect the full percentage of revenue. Without it, I'm not sure what it would be, how we'd be able to do that.
This is kind of a curiosity, and it might actually be Stephanie Smith's bailiwick, but while we have, ACCD and disaster recovery, reading about that parcel in Waterbury where some mitigation work to retain water.
the farm.
Yes,
in
was
Duxbury.
seen as likely to prevent flooding in downtown Waterbury. Did the state let go of that because it didn't seem like it was going to make enough of a difference? Or, the state does have tools eventually to say, we need this land to save the entire downtown.
I can't answer that. I'm not aware of that situation. Sorry.
You have to ask Stephanie that. I think that property is still in flux because there's been a transition family stuff going on.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to follow up on that.
But at some point, there's like an eminent domain question.
Oh, an eminent,
if the state's
definitely it's an
putting
eminent
money
domain
into
issue. Yeah.
Resilience, right?
At what point does the impact to a few which would protect the many?
Right.
That's a big question.
Is that an ongoing conversation? Because we are looking as well at like you know, life estate, like someone getting to stay in a property, but then gone, you know, it doesn't belong there anymore. I mean, it's really what Brattleboro had to do at some point is say like, it's painful, but we're moving everybody out of here. This is no longer gonna be developable land. Yeah.
So I do know that after Irene, you know, the state chose not to go beyond when the previous landowner, basically said, no, there's no circumstances where I'm going to cooperate here. There has been a transition in ownership, right? Through this process, and I do know that, you know, of course, that conversation started up again recently. I think this is another symptom of this, of that jump from municipal level to the state without having a regional level. A regional watershed discussion should talk about what needs to be done in that river corridor to protect the communities along that river corridor. It's not really a state conversation. It should be driven by the people that live in that region.
Inevitably, I think you're absolutely right. And now that we have the river corridor maps, now we're hoping for the mapping that we saw that Charlie and Catherine were showing us, and the mapping that we hope will come up, which isn't sadly due to us until the end of 25, I think.
Yeah.
But absolutely, our hope out of that is that mapping would identify key areas that we would be subject to possibly eminent domain that would be a regional solution to that mitigation and a corridor solution to that mitigation. But we aren't going to have those maps, sadly, for another year and a half at best, because it requires the one challenge is it requires building that engagement and ownership in that plan from the ground up, as it were, from the river bed up.
We will be able to identify some hot spots beforehand, and I think regional organization can also hopefully avoid eminent domain, right? I do think for Vermonters, someone from the state telling them to do something and someone from a group of
their own community
is a difference.
Sure. I'm just, you know, as we look at giving communities a pretty big carrot with exemption from Act 250 potentially, we just have to be really conscious of what we're asking them to do and sort of what responsibility, you know, that they have to take on in light of you know, climate change, and saying we need regionalization at the same time we're saying, you know, we don't need the state to be duplicating this process. We still need them to sort of own up to something if we're giving them TIFs and exemptions and things like that. Just to be clear. I mean, it could, you know, in my mind, there's some room for conversation about like, if you want to exempt more land in your community, you have to show that you have a healthy vacancy rate of some kind, you know, I mean, like that you have to somehow be showing that you're taking responsibility for the housing need in your community if you want to sort of protect land or set aside resources for something else. I don't know, but I think we, you know, this is like a lot of moving pieces that we're trying to pull together. And I don't want us to work at cross purposes. So we'll need your continued engagement on that front. So at this point, if there's not deep disagreement, we would continue to look at both of those pieces that have been proposed to us that have an impact on the education fund from a policy perspective, whether we think they do a good job furthering the economic development and housing infrastructure of the state, recognizing that the conversation is going to be different in finance.
Has anyone actually done a study that says that the increase in property taxes, I mean, if you buy 3 blighted lots. And then you put up a high rise and you are going, and it's a luxury high rise. Is the increase in property taxes really deterring developers? Is that the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really answer that for each and every developer. It's just probably something that it helps. It'll help for penciling out, going forward, that they're assured that there wouldn't be increases. So many municipalities already have some sort of tax stabilization for the municipal piece. And this would be, a much greater.
To do it on the state piece.
Right, yes.
In fact, unless we pass a bill tomorrow, they have to pay the school tax to the state, even though the buildings are gone, or abated completely. And so, given the state of the ed fund, really would like to see some evidence that it is the increase in the property taxes, the value of the property increases, that's deterring people, other than the person that owned the block in Montpelier since 1800, that's really deterring them from building. Right.
Right.
I don't think that's the problem.
No. Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to find it online last week, so I don't know if you felt like you got to ask that question. Did you feel like you got to ask that question, Senator Cummings? Like, how, have they heard that this is what incentivized?
I want to make sure that we're solving the problem, and until I know that the property taxes increase as the value increases, is what's deterring. It may deter some individual homeowners, but developers who are going to sell or rent can do their price tag, and I don't think the developer, most of them don't hold on to the properties. So that's just, I'd like to see some evidence that we're solving the problem.
Right.
And that the deep breath is worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'd have to take.
Okay, well, we're ending on time. Tomorrow is our big public safety joint hearing with judiciary, and thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you.
And health and welfare. Where is it?
It's on the Senate.
Oh, Senate chamber. Okay, that's right. I'm getting.
It's in the Senate chamber. Okay.
That's a big improvement.
us-
It wasn't initially in the Senate chamber.
Right, I think Senator Sears has some pull on that,
Well,
but we are starting at 8 a.m. with Commissioner Harrington. If people tune in on the drive or zoom in, that's fine. I just am getting the impression from our colleagues that this is a conversation that can't wait till we're done with our housing bill to get them on the record.
Unemployment.
yes, this is what's
This is
happening with
wait times,
UI right
et
now.
cetera.
And the ADS secretary will also be joining.
Oh, great, that's great. So we're digital services, because it's some,
Teresa, okay, great.
right,
She
yeah.
just had it confirmed.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have ADS present so they can, it's not just Department of Labor when it comes to what's happening with the technology to move it forward in some way. And did we invite legal aid just to be present?
No.
Okay.
That would
I
be
think I
great.
copied you on. They have a new unemployment person. So we'll start at 8 a.m., but feel free to, tune in on the drive.
I'm still.
We just need- Yeah. No, I think that was good to have on live.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you need to add for tomorrow?
In health and welfare, we always got coffee and donuts and we came in early.
I don't think you want me to touch anything and then bring it in committee. I do have some
We can't take it into this, in here. And sadly, I don't think Bohemian opens it.
I'm kidding.
No, I'm not kidding.
Well, I want some coffee and pastries from the Birch Grove.
Yes, they're open earlier. But, you know, that being said, I will bring something from upstairs downstairs.
Okay.
Always happy to do that.
Tomorrow, we're scheduled, for the meeting, with the pre-budget meeting with the state economist during this hour. Gotta figure out how to be two places at once again.
Oh, your caucus is? Okay.
No, it's just-
Oh,
No, that's right, at
Oh.
8:15.
I missed
That's
that.
been moved around so much, that the Economist is, because Thursday, it's,
Are we talking about the e-board?
yes.
Oh, we did have a meeting with e-board
This
scheduled.
was an e-board,
Oh, I
but
didn't-
basically there's